The morning sun painted the sky orange and pink as Jake Thompson walked slowly across his ranch. His boots made soft sounds on the dry grass. Everything was quiet except for the wind. At 67 years old, Jake had walked this same path thousands of times. But today felt different. Today might be one of the last times. Jake stopped at the old wooden fence and looked out at the empty fields. Just 3 years ago, these same fields were full of cattle, hundreds of them. Black and brown cows scattered across the green pastures like dots on a painting. The sound of their calls would wake him up every morning. Now there was nothing but silence and dust. He pulled out his old wallet from his back pocket. The leather was cracked and worn from years of use. Inside, he counted the bills slowly. $847. That was all he had left in the world. Everything else was gone. The Triple T Ranch had been in his family for over 80 years. His grandfather built the first house with his own hands back in 1943. His father grew up here, learned to ride horses here, and met Jake's mother at a barn dance right here on this land. Jake himself had taken his first steps in the old farmhouse. He learned to milk cows, fix fences, and brand cattle on this ranch. When Jake was young, the ranch was successful. They had over 500 head of cattle and made good money every year. The family was respected in town. They helped their neighbors during hard times and always paid their bills on time. Jake married his wife Betty here in 1978. They had their wedding right under the big oak tree that still stood near the house. Betty and Jake worked the ranch together for 45 years. She kept the books, cooked for the ranch hands, and helped with the animals. In the evenings, they would sit on the front porch and watch the sunset. Betty would talk about her plans for a bigger garden. Jake would point out which cattle needed checking the next day. Those were good times. But good times don't last forever. The trouble started 5 years ago when Betty got sick. At first, it seemed like just a bad cold. But the cold turned into something worse. The doctors ran test after test. Finally, they found cancer. The treatment was expensive. Very expensive. Jake sold half the cattle to pay for Betty's first surgery. When that money ran out, he sold more cattle. Then he sold the equipment. The tractor that his father bought in 1965 went to a neighbor for half its worth. The hay baler that helped them through 30 good summers was sold to a ranch 2 counties over. Betty fought hard for 3 years. Jake spent every dollar he could find on doctors, medicine, and hospital bills. He would have sold everything twice over if it meant one more day with his wife. But cancer doesn't care about love or money or how hard someone fights. Betty died on a Tuesday morning in March, holding Jake's hand. After the funeral, Jake tried to keep the ranch going. But cattle prices dropped. Feed prices went up. A bad drought killed most of the grass in the pastures. Without enough money to buy feed, Jake had to sell the rest of the cattle. One by one, they were loaded onto trucks and driven away. The bank started calling every week, then every day. The loan payments were 3 months behind. The property taxes were overdue. The electric company sent warning notices. Jake tried to get a job in town. But who wants to hire a 67-year-old cowboy with no other skills? Last month, the bank manager drove out to the ranch. He was a young man in a clean suit who had never worked a day outside in his life. He spoke in a gentle voice, but his words were harsh. The ranch would be auctioned off in 30 days. Jake had to be out by the end of the month. Jake signed the papers without arguing. There was no point in fighting anymore. He had lost everything that mattered. Standing there in the morning light, Jake thought about all the memories in this place. He remembered the day he brought Betty home as a new bride. He remembered working alongside his father during the busy summer months. He remembered the pride he felt when people in town called him a successful rancher. The old farmhouse looked tired now. The paint was peeling and several windows were cracked. The barn needed repairs that Jake couldn't afford to make. Weeds grew where Betty's flower garden used to bloom. Everything was falling apart just like his life. Jake walked over to the barn and opened the big wooden doors. Inside, dust particles danced in the sunlight. His father's old saddle hung on a hook, cracked and dry. Tools that hadn't been used in months sat covered in dust. In the corner was Betty's milking stool, where she sat every morning for 20 years to milk their old cow, Bessie. He picked up a pitchfork and held it in his hands. These tools had been his life. Working with his hands, caring for animals, living close to the land. This was all he knew how to do. In 30 days, he would have to leave it all behind and figure out how to live a completely different life. Jake had nowhere to go. No children to move in with. No relatives who could help. His closest neighbors were good people, but they had their own problems. The small house in town that he might be able to afford with his $847 wouldn't feel like home. Nothing would ever feel like home again. As he walked back to the house, Jake noticed the old truck sitting in the driveway. It was a 1998 Ford pickup that had seen better days. The paint was faded, the bumper was dented, and it used too much oil. But it still ran, and it was paid for. At least he wouldn't lose everything. Inside the house, Jake made coffee and sat at the kitchen table where he and Betty had shared thousands of meals. The silence was heavy. No radio playing. No Betty humming while she cooked. No cattle calling from the fields. Just quiet. He thought about what people in town were saying about him. Some felt sorry for the old rancher who lost everything. Others whispered that he should have managed his money better. A few said he was foolish to spend so much on medical bills when the outcome was hopeless anyway. Jake didn't care what they said. He would have spent twice as much if it meant saving Betty. The truth was, Jake felt tired. Tired of fighting. Tired of worrying about money. Tired of being alone. At his age, starting over seemed impossible. What kind of job could he get? Who would hire an old cowboy? How do you learn to live in town when you've spent your whole life on a ranch? Jake finished his coffee and washed the cup. He had learned to clean up after himself since Betty died. She had always taken care of the house while he took care of the land. Now he had to do both, and he wasn't very good at the house part. He decided to drive into town to buy groceries. With less than $850 to his name, every purchase had to be carefully planned. No more buying whatever he wanted. No more helping neighbors who were short on cash. No more donating to the church or local charities. Every dollar had to last. The drive to town took 20 minutes on dusty back roads. Jake had driven this route thousands of times, but today he noticed things differently. The fence posts that needed replacing. The neighbors' cattle looking fat and healthy. The new houses being built for people moving in from the city. Life was going on for everyone else while his world was ending. In town, people nodded politely when they saw him. Some asked how he was doing. Jake always answered fine, because what else could he say? That he was broke? That he was scared? That he felt like a failure? Small towns don't need that kind of honesty. At the grocery store, Jake bought only the basics. Bread, milk, eggs, some canned food. He counted every dollar and avoided the foods he really wanted. Steak was too expensive now. So was fresh fruit. He had learned to live on very little. Back at the ranch, Jake put away the groceries and sat on the front porch. The afternoon sun was warm on his face. In the distance, he could see the mountains where his cattle used to graze during the summer months. Everything looked the same, but everything was different. As evening approached, Jake thought about the cattle auction happening this weekend. He used to go to those auctions to buy cattle. Now other ranchers would come to buy his life's work when the bank auctioned off his land. The idea made him sick to his stomach, but maybe he would go anyway. Maybe he would watch one last auction and remember what it felt like to be a real rancher. Maybe he would say goodbye to the life he was losing. Jake didn't know it yet, but that decision to attend the auction would change everything. Sometimes the end of one story is really the beginning of another. Sometimes when you think you've lost everything, you're actually about to find something you never knew you were looking for. That night, Jake fell asleep in his old recliner, dreaming of better days and wondering what tomorrow would bring. Saturday morning came too early for Jake. He had barely slept, tossing and turning in his bed while thinking about the ranch auction coming up in 3 weeks. The coffee tasted bitter, and even the sunrise looked different somehow. Everything felt like it was ending. Jake almost changed his mind about going to the Riverside livestock auction. What was the point? He couldn't buy anything. He had no cattle to sell. Going would just remind him of everything he had lost. But something pulled him there anyway. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was nostalgia. Maybe he just wasn't ready to completely let go of his old life. The drive to Riverside took 45 minutes through rolling hills and farmland. Jake had made this trip hundreds of times over the years. Sometimes to buy cattle, sometimes to sell them, sometimes just to visit with other ranchers and catch up on local news. The auction barn was where deals were made and friendships were formed. It was where ranchers gathered to talk about weather, cattle prices, and the state of agriculture. As Jake pulled into the dusty parking lot, he saw familiar trucks and trailers. Old Bill Henderson was there with his worn-out Chevy. The Martinez brothers had brought their big rig to haul some bulls they were planning to buy. Even young Tommy Walsh was there. probably looking to start his own small herd. Inside the auction barn, the smell hit Jake immediately. It was a mixture of hay, cattle, and dust that every rancher knew by heart. The wooden bleachers were filling up with farmers and ranchers wearing their Saturday clothes: clean jeans, pressed shirts, and good boots. Jake found a seat near the back where he could watch without having to explain to everyone why he wasn't bidding on anything. The auctioneer, a man named Ron Phillips who had been calling auctions for 30 years, tested his microphone and shuffled through his papers. Ron knew every rancher in 3 counties. He had sold cattle for Jake many times over the years. When Ron spotted Jake in the crowd, he nodded and smiled, but Jake could see the sympathy in his eyes. Everyone knew about Jake's troubles. The first animals brought into the ring were young calves. They bawled for their mothers and stumbled around the sawdust-covered floor. Bidding was active and prices were decent. Jake watched the familiar dance of the auction, hands raised, heads nodded, and Ron's voice echoing through the barn as he called out increasing bids. Jake remembered when he used to participate in this dance. The excitement of spotting a good animal, the strategy of when to bid and when to wait, the satisfaction of winning a bid on exactly the right cattle for his operation. Those days seemed like a lifetime ago now. As the morning wore on, various cattle came and went. Dairy cows, beef cattle, breeding bulls. Jake knew the quality of most animals just by looking at them. It was a skill he had developed over 40 years of ranching. He could spot a good cow from across the barn and estimate its weight within 20 pounds. Around noon, Ron announced a special lot. "Folks, we've got something different today. 12 head of Mustang horses that need good homes. These are wild horses that were rounded up from federal land. They're healthy animals, but they haven't been handled much. They need someone with experience and patience." Jake looked up with interest. He had always loved horses, though the ranch had focused mainly on cattle. As a young man, he had trained several horses and was known in the area for his gentle methods. But he hadn't worked with horses in years. The first horse was led into the ring by 2 handlers using long ropes. It was a beautiful black mare with a flowing mane and wild eyes. She moved like liquid, her muscles rippling under her shiny coat. Even from the back of the barn, Jake could see the intelligence and spirit in her eyes. "This mare is about 8 years old," Ron announced. "She's healthy and strong. Would make a fine riding horse with the right training. Do I hear $50? A few hands went up around the barn. Jake watched as the bidding slowly climbed. $70, $80, $90. The prices were surprisingly low. In the old days, a horse like this would have brought several $100s easily. Then Jake heard something that made his blood run cold. A man in a dirty cap near the front of the barn called out, "What's the meat price on these horses?" Ron's face grew serious. "These horses are being sold as they are. What buyers do with them after that is their business." Jake's heart sank. He knew what that meant. There were buyers at auctions who purchased horses not to ride or train, but to sell to slaughter facilities. It was legal, but it broke Jake's heart. These beautiful wild animals would end up as dog food or shipped overseas for human consumption. One by one, more horses were brought into the ring. A bay stallion with a scar on his shoulder, a gray mare heavy with foal, a young colt that couldn't have been more than 2 years old. Each time the same pattern repeated. Low bids from a few genuine horse lovers, but always the man in the dirty cap watching and calculating meat prices. When the bidding ended on each horse, Jake watched with growing horror as most of them were bought by the meat buyer. The man had a truck and trailer outside, ready to load up his purchases and drive them to their fate. The last horse brought into the ring was different from the others. It was a smaller bay mare with a white blaze down her face and 3 white socks. She was older, maybe 12 or 13 years old. Her coat was dull and she looked tired, but there was something in her eyes that called to Jake. A dignity, a spirit that hadn't been broken despite whatever hardship she had faced. "Last horse of the day, folks," Ron announced. "This mare has been through some tough times, but she's got good bones and could still give someone years of service. Let's start the bidding at $25. Silence filled the barn. Nobody raised their hand. $25 was too much for an old horse that would need feed and care for years. But it was a bargain for a meat buyer who only cared about weight. $25, Ron repeated. "Anyone give me 25? The man in the dirty cap started to raise his hand. Something inside Jake snapped. Without thinking, without calculating, without worrying about his bank account, Jake shot to his feet. "I'll take them all," he shouted across the barn. The entire auction barn fell silent. Every head turned to look at the old rancher standing in the back row. Ron's mouth fell open. Even the horses seemed to sense that something important had just happened. "Excuse me, Jake?" Ron said into his microphone. "Did you say all of them?" Jake's heart was pounding, but his voice was steady. "Yes, sir. All 12 horses. I'll pay whatever the current total is." Ron quickly shuffled through his papers, adding up the winning bids. "That would be $837 for all 12 head. Jake's hand trembled as he pulled out his wallet. $837. He had exactly $10 more than that. If he bought these horses, he would have $10 left to his name. $10 to last until something happened. But looking at that last mare, at her tired but dignified eyes, Jake knew he couldn't let her go to slaughter. He couldn't let any of them go to slaughter. Maybe it was the memory of all the horses he had loved over the years. Maybe it was Betty's voice in his head, reminding him to always help those who couldn't help themselves. Maybe it was just a crazy old man making a crazy decision. "I'll pay cash," Jake announced, walking down toward the ring. The barn erupted in whispers. Jake Thompson, the man who was losing his ranch, the man everyone knew was broke, had just spent his last dollar on 12 wild horses he had nowhere to keep and no way to feed. The meat buyer threw his cap on the ground in disgust and stomped out of the barn. Several ranchers shook their heads in disbelief. Old Bill Henderson muttered something about Jake finally losing his mind. But as Jake handed over his money to Ron, he felt something he hadn't felt in months. Purpose. For the first time since Betty died. For the first time since he lost the cattle. For the first time since the bank told him he was losing the ranch, Jake felt like he had done something that mattered. "Jake," Ron said quietly as he counted the bills. "You sure about this? These horses are wild. They're going to need a lot of work and a lot of feed." Jake looked over at the horses standing in the holding pen. The black mare was watching him with intelligent eyes. The pregnant gray mare stood protectively near the young colt. The old bay mare with the white blaze seemed to nod at him, as if she knew what he had just done for her. "I'm sure," Jake said. "I've got some land leased for another 3 weeks. That'll give me time to figure something out." As Jake signed the papers and arranged for transportation, word spread through the barn about what he had done. Some people thought he was foolish. Others thought he was crazy. But a few older ranchers, men who remembered when the land was different and when taking care of animals meant more than profit margins, quietly shook Jake's hand and told him he had done the right thing. Loading the horses took 2 hours. They were scared and didn't trust the humans trying to help them. Jake had to borrow trailers from 3 different neighbors to transport all 12 horses back to his ranch. With each trailer that pulled away from the auction barn, Jake felt more committed to his decision. On the drive home, Jake tried not to think about what he had just done. He had no money left, no plan, no idea how he was going to feed 12 horses when he could barely feed himself. By Sunday morning, news about Jake's horse purchase had spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire. In small towns, word travels fast, especially when it's about someone doing something completely unexpected. People talked about it at church, at the diner, and at the gas station. Everyone had an opinion about what Jake Thompson had done. At Miller's Cafe, the usual Sunday morning crowd gathered around their coffee cups and shook their heads in disbelief. "That old fool has finally lost his mind," said Harold Winters, the bank manager who held the loan on Jake's ranch. "Man can't even pay his own bills, and he spends his last dollar on a bunch of wild horses." Betty Rodriguez, who owned the local feed store, stirred her coffee thoughtfully. "Those horses are going to need hay and grain. 12 horses eat a lot. Where's Jake going to get money for feed?" "He's not thinking straight," added Tom Peterson, who farmed the land next to Jake's ranch. "Grief does strange things to a man. First he loses Betty, then the cattle, now this. Someone should talk sense into him." But not everyone in town thought Jake was crazy. Old Pete Martinez, who had ranched in the area for 60 years, defended Jake's decision. Those horses would have gone to slaughter. Jake saved their lives. A man's got to live with himself, and Jake couldn't live knowing he let that happen when he could have stopped it. The argument continued through breakfast and followed people to church. Even Pastor Williams addressed it indirectly in his sermon about helping those who cannot help themselves. Some people nodded, thinking about the horses. Others shook their heads, thinking about Jake's poor judgment. Meanwhile, Jake was dealing with the reality of his decision. He had spent Saturday evening setting up temporary fencing on a small piece of leased land behind his property. The landowner, a widow named Mrs. Patterson, had agreed to let Jake use the 5-acre pasture for $50 a month. It wasn't much space for 12 horses, but it was all Jake could afford. The horses arrived late Saturday night, and getting them unloaded was a challenge. They were scared, confused, and didn't trust the humans trying to help them. The black mare, who seemed to be the leader of the group, watched every move Jake made with suspicious eyes. The pregnant gray mare stayed as far away from the humans as possible. The young colt pressed close to his mother's side, trembling with fear. Jake had managed to borrow enough hay from neighbors to last a few days, but he had no money to buy more. He had exactly $10 in his wallet, and his next small Social Security check wouldn't come for 2 weeks. Even then, it would barely cover his basic living expenses, let alone feed for 12 horses. On Sunday morning, Jake sat on an old milk crate near the temporary fence and watched the horses. They huddled together in one corner of the pasture, as far from him as they could get. Every time he moved, their heads shot up and their ears went back. These were animals that had lived their entire lives without human contact, and they saw people as dangerous predators. The black mare seemed to be testing the fence, looking for weak spots where the group might escape. She was clearly the leader, and the other horses followed her movements closely. Jake decided to call her Liberty, because she represented the freedom these horses had lost when they were captured from the wild. As Jake sat quietly watching, neighbors started driving by to see what all the fuss was about. Some slowed down just enough to get a good look before driving on. Others stopped to ask questions or offer opinions. Most of the comments weren't encouraging. "Jake, what in the world are you thinking?" asked Carol Henderson, rolling down her window as she drove past. "Those horses are wild as deer. You can't do anything with them." "They're beautiful animals," Jake replied calmly. "They just need time to trust people again." Carol shook her head. "Time is something you don't have much of. Bank's going to take this place in 3 weeks. Where are you going to put 12 horses then?" Jake didn't have an answer for that question. He was taking things one day at a time and hoping something would work out. By Monday morning, the practical problems became more serious. The horses had eaten most of the borrowed hay, and Jake had no money to buy more. He drove to Betty's feed store to see if he could work out some kind of payment plan. "Jake, I'd like to help you," Betty Rodriguez said kindly, "but I've got my own bills to pay. I can't extend credit to someone who—" She paused, not wanting to say the obvious truth. "Someone who's broke," Jake finished for her. "I understand, Betty. I'll figure something out." But figuring something out was harder than Jake expected. He called every feed supplier in 3 counties, and the answer was always the same: cash up front or no feed. His credit was ruined, and everyone knew about his financial troubles. Jake spent Monday afternoon walking around his property, looking for anything else he could sell. The old tractor was already sold. The cattle were gone. Most of the tools had been sold to pay medical bills. There wasn't much left except some old fence posts and a rusty water tank that nobody would want. That evening, Jake sat in his kitchen and tried to make a list of options. Maybe he could get a job in town. But who would hire a 67-year-old man with no experience outside of ranching? Maybe he could ask the church for help, but they were already helping several families in need. Maybe he could find someone who wanted to buy the horses. But anyone interested in wild Mustangs would probably want to pay even less than he had paid at the auction. The hardest part was the way people looked at him now. When Jake went to town for groceries on Tuesday, he could feel the stares and hear the whispered conversations. At the post office, people who used to greet him warmly now just nodded politely and looked away. He had become the local crazy man who threw away his last dollar on a bunch of worthless horses. Even his closest friends were concerned. When old Pete Martinez stopped by Tuesday evening, his conversation was gentle but direct. "Jake, I've known you for 40 years, Pete said, sitting on the front porch and looking out at the horses. "You've always been a sensible man. But this doesn't make sense. You can't feed these horses. You can't train them. In 3 weeks, you won't even have a place to keep them." Jake sipped his coffee and watched Liberty pacing along the fence line. "Maybe it doesn't make sense, Pete, but it felt right at the time." "Feeling right and being smart are 2 different things," Pete replied. "These horses are beautiful, but they're not going to pay your bills or put food on your table." "I couldn't let them go to slaughter," Jake said quietly. "I've lost everything else, Pete, my wife, my cattle, my ranch. I couldn't stand by and watch those horses get loaded onto a truck heading to the meat plant. Sometimes a man has to make a stand even if it's not the smartest thing to do." Pete nodded slowly. He understood the principle even if he thought Jake's method was wrong. "What are you going to do when the hay runs out?" "I don't know," Jake admitted. "I'm hoping something will work out." "Hope doesn't buy hay," Pete said bluntly. "And those horses are going to be hungry whether you meant well or not." As the week progressed, Jake's situation became more desperate. The horses had eaten through the borrowed hay, and Jake was feeding them grass he cut by hand with an old scythe. It wasn't enough nutrition for 12 animals, especially the pregnant mare who needed extra food for her developing foal. Jake tried everything he could think of. He called ranchers in neighboring counties, hoping someone might need help with their cattle in exchange for hay. He visited every farm supply store within 50 miles, looking for someone who might trade feed for labor. He even considered selling his truck, but he needed transportation to find work. The horses seemed to sense his stress. They watched him from across the pasture as he paced and muttered to himself, trying to figure out a solution. Liberty, the black mare, had stopped testing the fence and now spent most of her time standing near the gate, as if she was waiting for something to happen. On Friday morning, Jake sat on his milk crate with a cup of coffee and watched the sunrise. The horses were moving slowly, conserving energy because they weren't getting enough food. The pregnant mare looked uncomfortable, and Jake worried that stress and poor nutrition might cause her to lose her foal. That's when Jake made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of sitting passively and hoping for a miracle, he decided to try something different. If these horses were going to trust him, he needed to start building that trust now. Even if he didn't know how he was going to feed them next week, Jake stood up, walked slowly to the fence, and sat down just a few feet from where the horses were standing. Liberty immediately moved the group away from him, but they didn't go as far as usual. For the first time since the auction, one of the horses, the old bay mare with the white blaze, looked directly at him without backing away. "Easy, girl," Jake said softly. "I know you don't trust me yet. I know you think all humans are dangerous, but I'm trying to help you. I spent my last dollar on you and your friends, and I'm going to figure out how to take care of you, even if I don't know how yet." The mare stood still for almost a full minute, just looking at him. Then she turned and walked away, but Jake felt like something had changed. It was a tiny step, but it was the first step toward building trust with these wild animals. As Jake sat by the fence that morning, he didn't know that his story was about to take another unexpected turn. 3 weeks into his struggle with the horses, Jake had established a routine that surprised everyone, including himself. Every morning at sunrise, he would carry his coffee to the fence and sit quietly on his old milk crate. The horses would watch him from across the small pasture, their ears forward, alert but no longer panicked by his presence. Liberty, the black mare who led the group, had become less aggressive about moving the herd away from Jake. She still kept her distance, but she no longer snorted and pawed the ground when he approached the fence. The old bay mare with the white blaze, whom Jake had started calling Hope, had even taken a few steps closer to the fence a couple of times before losing her nerve. Jake had managed to stretch his feed supplies by cutting grass from the roadside ditches and gathering fallen apples from abandoned orchards. It wasn't enough, but it was something. The horses were losing weight, though, and Jake knew his makeshift feeding plan wouldn't work much longer. On a Thursday morning, as Jake sat by the fence talking softly to the horses, a truck he didn't recognize pulled into his driveway. It was a newer model Ford with veterinary equipment visible in the back. A woman got out and walked toward the pasture with the confident stride of someone who spent a lot of time around animals. "Mr. Thompson?" she called as she approached. "I'm Dr. Lisa Chen. I'm the new veterinarian in town." Jake stood up and walked over to meet her. Dr. Chen was younger than he expected, probably in her early 30s, with short black hair and kind eyes. She wore jeans, boots, and a work shirt that showed she wasn't afraid to get dirty. "Nice to meet you, Doc," Jake said, wondering why a veterinarian was visiting him. "Is there something I can help you with?" Dr. Chen smiled and looked over at the horses. "Actually, I was hoping I could help you. I've heard about what you did at the auction, and I wanted to see these horses for myself." Jake felt his face flush with embarrassment. "I suppose you've heard all the talk in town about the crazy old man who spent his last dollar on a bunch of wild horses." "I heard about a man who saved 12 animals from slaughter," Dr. Chen replied firmly. "That's not crazy. That's compassionate." As they talked, Dr. Chen explained that she had recently moved to Cedar Ridge from Colorado, where she had worked extensively with wild horses and horse rescue operations. She had specialized training in dealing with traumatized and untrained animals, something that was rare in their rural area. "I've been looking for an opportunity to continue that kind of work here," she said, watching the horses with a professional eye. "When I heard about your situation, I thought maybe we could help each other." Jake was puzzled. "Doc, I appreciate the offer, but I can't pay for veterinary services. I don't even know how I'm going to buy feed next week." Dr. Chen laughed. "Mr. Thompson, I'm not here to charge you money. I'm here because I love working with wild horses, and these animals need help that I'm qualified to provide. Consider it a professional learning opportunity for me." Over the next hour, Dr. Chen examined the horses from a distance, making notes about their condition and behavior. She was impressed with how calm they seemed around Jake, especially considering they had only been in captivity for 3 weeks. "You've done something remarkable here," she told Jake. "These horses are more relaxed than I would expect. Usually wild horses stay completely panicked around humans for months. Yours are actually showing signs of curiosity about you." "I just sit here and talk to them," Jake said, feeling foolish. "Probably sounds crazy." "It sounds like exactly the right approach," Dr. Chen replied. "Building trust with wild horses is all about patience and consistency. You're doing it instinctively." Dr. Chen had more good news. She had connections with wild horse preservation groups in the Bureau of Land Management. After examining the horses more closely, she discovered something that made her very excited. "Mr. Thompson, do you see that stallion over there? The bay with the dark mane?" She pointed to one of the younger horses that Jake hadn't paid much attention to. "Unless I'm mistaken, he's got bloodline markings that suggest he might be descended from one of the original Spanish horse herds that ran wild in this area over 100 years ago." Jake looked at the horse with new interest. "What does that mean?" "It means he could be genetically significant. There are organizations that pay good money to preserve those bloodlines. And that pregnant mare? If her foal carries the same genetics, you could be looking at animals worth thousands of dollars each, not just as riding horses, but as breeding stock for preservation programs." For the first time in weeks, Jake felt a spark of hope. But Dr. Chen wasn't finished with her revelations. "There's something else," she said, pulling out her phone. "I took some photos of your horses and sent them to a colleague who works with the Wild Horse Protection Association. She recognized 3 of these animals from a herd that was illegally rounded up from protected federal land. These horses shouldn't have been at a livestock auction in the first place." Jake felt confused. "What does that mean for me?" "It means you might have saved animals that are legally protected. The government agencies responsible for wild horse management are going to be very interested in what you've done here." Dr. Chen explained that there were federal programs designed to support people who rescued protected wild horses. There might be grants available for feed, fencing, and care. There were also organizations that paid people to maintain wild horses on private land as part of conservation efforts. "But first," she said, "we need to get these animals healthy and start the process of gentling them. Are you willing to work with me on this?" Jake felt overwhelmed. A week ago, he thought he had made the worst financial decision of his life. Now a veterinarian was telling him he might have rescued horses that could be worth thousands of dollars and might qualify for government support. "Doc, I'm willing to try anything," he said, "but I still don't have money for feed." Dr. Chen smiled. "Let me make some phone calls. I think we can solve that problem too." Over the next few days, Dr. Chen proved to be as good as her word. She contacted the Wild Horse Protection Association, the Bureau of Land Management, and several horse rescue organizations. Jake's story, the broke rancher who spent his last dollar to save horses from slaughter, spread quickly through the network of horse lovers and conservationists. By the following Tuesday, Jake's phone was ringing constantly. A horse rescue group in Denver offered to donate feed. A wild horse sanctuary in Montana wanted to send a trainer to help with the gentling process. The local newspaper wanted to do a story about the rescued horses. But the biggest surprise came when Dr. Chen arrived at the ranch with a truck full of hay and a representative from the Bureau of Land Management. "Mr. Thompson," said the government official, a serious woman named Janet Wilson, "we've confirmed that these horses were illegally removed from protected federal land. You've actually helped us recover stolen animals. The government would like to compensate you for their care and offer you a contract to maintain them as part of our wild horse preservation program." Jake sat down hard on his milk crate. "You want to pay me to take care of these horses?" That's exactly what we want to do, Janet Wilson replied. The initial payment would be $1,500 to cover their care so far, plus $500 per month for as long as you're willing to keep them. We'll also provide feed, veterinary care, and help with improving your facilities. Jake looked over at the horses who were watching this unusual gathering with curious eyes. Liberty had actually moved closer to the fence, and Hope was standing just a few yards away from the humans. They seemed to sense that something important was happening. There's one more thing, Dr. Chen added with a grin. I contacted a local television station about your story. They want to do a feature about the cowboy who saved the wild horses. It's going to air next week. Jake felt dizzy. In the space of 1 week, he had gone from being the town fool to being offered a government contract and television coverage. I don't understand how this all happened so fast. Sometimes doing the right thing creates opportunities you never expected, Dr. Chen explained. You saved these horses without thinking about what you might get in return. Now people want to help you because they admire what you did. As the afternoon went on, more unexpected visitors arrived. A local hay farmer offered to provide feed at cost. The owner of the farm supply store, who had refused Jake credit just 2 weeks earlier, came by to apologize and offer a payment plan for any equipment he might need. Even Pastor Williams stopped by to say that the church was taking up a special collection to help with the horse rescue. That evening, as Jake sat by the fence with his coffee, he tried to process everything that had happened. 2 weeks ago, he was down to his last $10 and facing homelessness. Now he had a steady income, free veterinary care, and more support than he knew what to do with. Liberty approached the fence and stood just a few feet away from Jake. For the first time since the auction, she didn't move away when he spoke to her. Well, girl, Jake said softly, looks like we're going to be partners in this horse business. I spent my last dollar on you, and now it turns out you might be worth more than I ever imagined. The mare stretched her neck toward him, not quite close enough to touch, but closer than she had ever come. Hope. 6 months after Jake Thompson spent his last dollar at the horse auction, the transformation of his life was so complete that people who knew the old story could hardly believe the new reality. What had started as an act of desperate compassion had grown into something nobody could have predicted. The local television story about Jake and his horses had aired on a slow news day in November. The reporter, a young woman named Jennifer Walsh, had expected to film a simple human interest piece about an old cowboy and some rescued horses. Instead, she found herself documenting what would become one of the most inspiring stories of the year. The footage of Jake sitting quietly by the fence while Liberty and Hope approached him voluntarily had touched something deep in viewers. The image of the weathered rancher gently stroking the nose of a wild horse that had learned to trust him became an instant symbol of patience, kindness, and the power of never giving up. Within days of the broadcast, Jake's phone was ringing from morning until night. Horse lovers from across the country called to offer support. Donations began arriving in the mail. A website set up by Dr. Lisa Chen to share updates about the horses received thousands of visits from people who had fallen in love with Jake's story. But the real changes began when larger organizations took notice. The American Wild Horse Protection Alliance featured Jake's story in their national newsletter. The International Fund for Animal Welfare highlighted his rescue efforts in their annual report. Suddenly, Jake Thompson wasn't just a local news story. He was becoming a national symbol of wildlife conservation. The attention brought opportunities that Jake had never dreamed possible. A major feed company offered to sponsor the horses, providing all their nutrition needs for free in exchange for the right to use Jake's story in their marketing. A fencing company donated materials and labor to build proper facilities for the growing herd. Even the bank that had been ready to foreclose on his ranch called to discuss new loan options. Mr. Thompson, said Harold Winters, the bank manager, who had once dismissed Jake as a hopeless case, we'd like to restructure your debt and discuss expansion loans for your horse operation. Jake looked across the desk at the man who had been ready to take his land 6 months earlier. Harold, 6 months ago you told me I was finished as a rancher. 6 months ago, you were running cattle on land that couldn't support them, Harold replied with embarrassment. Now you're running a conservation operation that's bringing positive attention to our entire community. That's a very different business model. The business model was indeed different, and it was working better than anyone had expected. The SABEI, Bureau of Land Management, had increased Jake's monthly payments when they realized the quality of care he was providing. Additional horses from other illegal roundups had been brought to his facility. The herd had grown from 12 to 30 animals, with several healthy foals born on the ranch. Dr. Chen had become Jake's full partner in the operation, bringing her expertise with wild horses and her connections in the conservation community. Together, they had developed a program that went far beyond just caring for rescued horses. "Jake, I have an idea I want to run by you," Dr. Chen said one morning, as they watched the horses in the expanded pastures. "What would you think about starting an educational program here? Schools could bring students to learn about wild horses and conservation. We could offer tours for the public. Maybe even start a therapy program using some of the gentler horses." Jake was intrigued. "What kind of therapy program?" "Horses are amazing for helping people heal from trauma," Dr. Chen explained. "Veterans with PTSD, children who have been abused, people recovering from addiction. There's something about the trust between humans and horses that helps people learn to trust again themselves." The therapy program became the most meaningful part of Jake's new life. Working with Dr. Chen and a licensed therapist named Patricia Gonzalez, they began offering sessions for people who needed emotional healing. The same patience and gentleness that Jake had used to win over the wild horses proved perfect for helping traumatized humans. Liberty, the black mare, who had been the most suspicious of humans, became the star of the therapy program. Her transformation, from a terrified wild animal to a gentle partner who seemed to sense when someone needed comfort, was nothing short of miraculous. Children who hadn't spoken since traumatic experiences would whisper to Liberty. Veterans who couldn't sleep at night found peace grooming her in the quiet barn. "It's like she knows," Jake told Dr. Chen after watching Liberty work with a young boy who had been through a difficult divorce. "She knows when someone is hurting and she knows how to help." Hope, the old bay mare who had been the first to trust Jake, became the teacher for people who were just beginning their healing journey. Her calm, steady presence helped nervous visitors feel safe around the horses. Jake often sat with new therapy clients near Hope's stall, sharing his own story of loss and recovery, while the old mare stood quietly nearby. The success of the therapy program brought even more attention. A documentary filmmaker contacted Jake about creating a feature film about his story. A publisher approached him about writing a book. Horse trainers from around the world visited the ranch to learn about Jake's gentle methods of working with traumatized animals. But perhaps the most surprising development was the impact on Cedar Ridge itself. The small town that had once whispered about Jake's folly was now proud to be home to the Thompson Wild Horse Sanctuary. Tourism increased as people from hundreds of miles away came to visit the famous rescued horses. Local businesses flourished as visitors needed places to eat, sleep, and shop. The town council voted to put up signs on the highway identifying Cedar Ridge as home of the Thompson Wild Horse Sanctuary. The mayor, who had once privately criticized Jake's decision, now bragged about him at every opportunity. "Jake Thompson put our town on the map," Mayor Patricia Stevens announced at a council meeting. What he did for those horses ended up being the best thing that ever happened to our community. Not everything had been easy. Learning to manage a conservation operation while dealing with media attention and constant visitors had been overwhelming at first. Jake had to hire help and learn new skills about business management, public relations, and educational programming. There were days when he missed the simple life of raising cattle, but on quiet mornings, when Jake sat by the fence with his coffee and watched the horses grazing peacefully in the expanded pastures, he knew he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The ranch that he had almost lost was now 3 times its original size. The empty bank account had been replaced by a thriving business that supported several families. The lonely widower had become the center of a community of people who shared his love for horses and healing. 1 year after the auction, Jake stood in the same spot where he had once counted his last $847 and wondered how he would survive. Now he was watching Liberty play with her 6-month-old foal, while Hope taught a group of therapy horses how to be gentle with visiting children. Dr. Chen was leading a tour for veterinary students who had come to study their rehabilitation methods. In the distance, he could see construction workers building a new visitor center funded by donations from around the world. "Betty would have loved this," Jake said out loud, speaking to his late wife as he often did. She always said that good things happen to people who help others. I just never imagined it would happen like this. As if in response, Liberty approached the fence and gently nuzzled Jake's shoulder. The same horse who had once tried to escape from humans now sought out his company. The transformation was complete, but it was just the beginning. Jake's story had inspired similar rescue efforts in 12 other states. The Thompson method of patient horse rehabilitation was being taught at veterinary schools. A scholarship, fund established in Betty's name, was helping low-income families access the therapy program. The old cowboy who thought his life was over had become a teacher, a healer, and an inspiration to thousands of people. That evening, as Jake sat on his front porch and watched the sunset paint the sky orange and pink, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. Losing everything had been the most painful experience of his life, but it had also been the beginning of something more meaningful than anything he could have planned. His phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Chen. Jake, the wild horse. Protection Alliance wants to give you their Lifetime Achievement Award next month. I told them you'd probably say no, but I think you should consider it. Jake smiled and typed back. Tell them I'll accept it on behalf of all the horses who taught me that sometimes losing everything is just life's way of making room for something better. As the stars came out over the ranch, Jake could hear the gentle sounds of horses moving through the pastures. Liberty's foal was learning to run, his hooves drumming against the earth in a rhythm that sounded like Hope. In the barn, Hope was teaching another rescued horse how to trust humans. In town, people were talking about the next group of visitors coming to see the famous sanctuary. Jake Thompson had spent his last dollar to save 12 horses from slaughter. In return, those horses had saved him from a life of loneliness and regret. They had given him purpose, community,